Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well, guys. As you can see, my beard is still going strong. Probably won't be surviving for much longer, so I'm going to enjoy my last few days with it. I wanted to make a quick video on quite a straightforward topic, really. I think I've talked about this before, in a video way back. It's about the fact that there are lots of different kinds of broad kinds of INFJs, and that INFJ is actually a type that is very diverse in terms of the subtypes it houses. It's true that, according to objective personality, for example, every single type has 32 different subvariants, and that's all very good. But obviously, when you're at that level of, specificity, it becomes really difficult to distinguish between one type of INFJ or another type. So in this video, I wanted to concentrate on five types. Five types of INFJ. Why do I want to talk about these five types? I think that's my purpose ultimately, is to maybe help you, if necessary or helpful, to figure out, what kind of INFJ you are, and also perhaps actually to reach a certain kind of certainty about whether you're an INFJ or not, because some of you may still wonder whether they are, especially if you are looking at descriptions online. You will notice that it's quite possible you won't completely relate to the descriptions that are given online. And this is because most of what you will see in online definitions, the broad, accessible, mainstream definitions, actually corresponds to only two of those five types. There's two dominant types. What's interesting is that, in my experience, those types are not even necessarily dominant in actuality. One of them is quite common, but the other one is probably a bit less common, and there are types that are less mentioned that are more common. So what do I mean by this? So to discuss those five types, and I'll specify which ones I think are very common in the online and mainstream literature by the INFJ, which may induce you to think, oh, I don't correspond to that kind of description, therefore I'm not INFJ. Whereas you might be another type, another subtype. In order to distinguish between those five types, I'm going to make use of the Enneagram terminology. So hopefully you guys are familiar with it. If not, or on the assumption that maybe some of you are not, I'm going to try to speak in as broad terms as possible. So, unlike most of the types, INFJs can be of almost any Enneagram type, except, I think, pretty much except 7 and 8. Any other type, no, 3 as well. 3 would be either non-existent or extremely rare. 3, 7, and 8. So that means there are 6 possible types of INFJ, but here I will discuss only 5, because these are the types that strike me as the most common or the most salient, let's say. So the first type of INFJ that I'm thinking of, beginning with the Enneagram type 1, is the Reformer type. So this comes across often in the mainstream literature online. It would be the description of the INFJ as someone who is, called the advocate, someone who is involved in activist kind of activities, who is politically or socially very committed to changing society, and who has a lot of ideals that they want to see realized. Often they're used as an example to distinguish the INFJ from the INFP, who is supposed to be more creative and less of a reformer type. Well, the reality is that is a type of INFJ for sure, and it's maybe a bit less common among INFPs. But that type of INFJ, the reformer INFJ, from what my experience, and I like to know what you guys' experiences is as well, so you can tell me in the comments. is that it's actually not the most common type. Either it's not the most common type, or the only exception I can think of is that maybe because they're reformers, they don't have a lot of time to be online, and so they're underrepresented online. But I don't think that's the case. They're introverts, and online these days is a place where, you know, a lot of reformists and activists, you know, enterprises can be launched, so they should be online. So they are just not the most common type. It's the reformer type INFJ. And if I had to think of an example from history, I would pick probably Martin Luther King as such a type. Now, the second type of INFJ, again, very represented in the literature, and in fact very common, more common than the reformer type, is the helper type. So the helper INFJ type, which would correspond roughly speaking to the Enneagram 2, is the INFJ that is described as being constantly worrying about others, or let's say often worrying about others, deriving a lot of satisfaction from helping others. Now, that's the case of all the INFJs. The helper, though, really gets satisfaction from concrete levels of help. So it's, whereas maybe a different kind of INFJ would be satisfied with being a kind of broad sort of, you know, guide that doesn't need to interact with a lot of people at a very personal level, but to have a kind of moral influence. They derive satisfaction from that type. The reformer type would derive satisfaction from that, among other types. The helper is more social, more concrete, likes direct interaction, likes to concretely help people, and is often, you know, struggling sometimes to carve out a space for themselves because of the very strong empathy they feel day to day. That's a very common INFJ type, don't deny that. But if you don't quite fit that description, that doesn't mean you're not an INFJ, it just means that you're not an INFJ helper type. So that's type 2, possibly the most common, although I think that in order to be the most common, you would have to beat the next type that I'm going to describe, which could be the most common, and I would describe it, broadly speaking, as the creative type. So in order to describe the creative type, first of all, I would associate it with a type 4 INFJ, and so that would typically be the INFJ that looks the most like an INFP on the surface. Obviously, the functions are completely different, so really the INFJ 4 and the INFP 4 have nothing functional in common, but they can seem broadly alike, which is why some INFJs, such as Dostoevsky or Hermann Hesse, two writers in this case, they can be writers or they can be musicians, they're often seen as an INFPs. You can think also of someone like Leonard Cohen, so the songwriter. So if you take Leonard Cohen and Tom Waits, for instance, who's an INFP, right? A lot of fans of Leonard Cohen would also be fans of Tom Waits. If you listen to their music without thinking too much about it, you can think, well, you know, they have a lot in common. But if you listen more specifically, you'll notice. I'm not going to go into this, in detail right now because this is not the point of the video. But FI and Tom Waits, FE and Leonard Cohen. Leonard Cohen is a type 4. So here you see again that you can have INFJs that seem like INFPs, but because they express themselves mostly creatively. Now, they have a lot in common with the other INFJs, including a tendency to be oriented toward the future and deriving satisfaction from, in some sense, helping humanity. But they would convey this mostly through ideals embodied in their art. So that could be in music, that can be in painting, that can be in acting. You know, Daniel Day-Lewis would be another example of an INFJ type 4. So that's a very common type of INFJ as well. So you see that it's actually not that similar to the INFJ type 2. The INFJ type 4 is not going to be someone who on the day-to-day basis is going to go everywhere and try to kind of see how they can be helpful to others and derive primary satisfaction from that. In a sense, that the type 2 INFJ, the helper, is most like an ENFJ, whereas the INFJ creative is a little bit more like an INFP, you could perhaps say, but not functionally like an INFP and still very much an INFJ. Now, the fourth type I want to discuss is what you could describe as the Thinker INFJ. So often they would be type 5 or 6. So they would be, in Enneagram parlance, they would be head types. So this is where you would see, INFJs that are interested in very theoretical subjects, intellectual, cerebral types of INFJs. You'd have most of famous INFJ philosophers, when they're not reformer types like Plato, would be thinker types, like Schopenhauer, like Wittgenstein, and others. You'd have also some INFJ type 6 among researchers. There's a famous researcher in France who's a demographer as well as a sociologist, and he's a type 6. So, more often that would be, a type 5 with a 4-wing or 6-wing, sometimes a type 6. But you'd find those INFJs, they seem a little bit more maybe like INTJs or INTPs, because again, although they have similar aspirations, the way in which they channel those aspirations is not primarily through creative means or through concrete helping of others or through reform or social activism, but it will be through intellect, cerebral kind of work, philosophy, science sometimes even. Niels Bohr, if you're familiar with him, is usually seen as an INFJ and is a physicist, a very influential physicist of the first half of the 20th century. And finally, we are going to discuss a type that is actually quite common, even though it is I'd say that it is more present in the literature than the creative type INFJ and the thinker type INFJ, because those spots in the literature are often sort of occupied by INTJs, INTPs, and INFPs. The contemplative type, so that would be the fifth type of INFJ subtype that I wanted to discuss. The contemplative type, which is most associated with the type 9 INFJ, is quite common. If you spend some time online on INFJ forums or interacting in the YouTube section of videos, you'll come across them. They're often INFJs who are very in tune with their NI, who are, again, not particularly reformist, not particularly helper oriented in the concrete sense. So they would not quite be like the type 1 or type 2 INFJs. Just like the others, their aspirations are the same: making an impact on the world, having a mentoring role, having an influence on others, a feeling influence on others for the good. So like you'll find these parameters in every case for an INFJs among their top hierarchy values, all expressed differently. The contemplative will often be a really, really good listener and will tend to spend a lot of time contemplating insights without necessarily being too concerned to translate them intellectually or even artistically. They like to be in touch with the world as much as possible and to reach a kind of wisdom coming from having the sort of perfect sense of how to drift along existence in the most harmonious way possible, and to learn how to achieve that and share their wisdom with others, but without ever, they're not proactive. They don't tend to tell other people what to do, even for their own good, such as a helper type INFJ can do sometimes. But they do derive a lot of satisfaction from being consulted, being seen as the kind of wise, insightful type that spends a lot of time on their own, but also like to share their insights. So in some ways they can come across as the most passive INFJs and the most chill INFJs, but they're, like I said numerous times across this video, their ultimate aspirations are shared with all the others. They just happen to be a little bit more phlegmatic, maybe you could say. And so there you have it, 5 types of INFJ. I've become aware that I have a number of followers now on YouTube, and many of them are INFJs, so I'd be more than curious to hear, broadly speaking, with which category you identify. My guess is that if you talk about broad statistics, the creative type and the helper type are the most common. Then you would have the reformer type and the contemplative type, and then lastly the thinker type. But let me know, let's have a chat. All right, see you soon, guys.